Sustainability can often seem like a depressing catalog of doom and gloom. But although we face serious challenges, a better and more sustainable future is possible. Welcome to Sustainable Planet.
I'm political scientist Kimberly Weir, and today I'm here with Rob Wolcott and Kaihan Krippendorf to talk about their new book, Proximity: How Coming Breakthroughs in Just-in-Time Transform Business, Society, and Daily Life. In addition to his adjunct teaching of business and management classes at the University of Chicago and Northwestern University, Rob is the co-founder and chair of the World Innovation Network. Kaihan is a former McKinsey consultant, professional speaker, and the CEO and founder of Outthinker Networks, a global think tank aimed at shaping the future of business. Hi, Rob and Kaihan. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Kimberly. Good to see you.
Great to be here, Kimberly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I really enjoyed reading your book. I was a bit scared by some of it too, though, I have to admit. With the future, what the future has to bring to us here and what it has for us. And so I'm really excited to talk about proximity. But I was wondering, the term proximity, it's so totally appropriate choice for your book. Were you inspired by the new European Bauhaus movement?
Well, I was taken when you sent that question to us in preparation for this, Kimberly, because the honest truth is, no, that wasn't on our radar. But when I saw you made the connection, it makes perfect sense. But there's an interesting synchronicity here. When I sent Heather Crosby, so I've worked with a designer for probably 15 years, and she's brilliant. She lives in the mountains in West Virginia, actually, because she wants to. And I sent her a remit for this project, and I said, I'd love a, simple Bauhaus kind of design for the cover. So this X actually refers to the point of demand. So there's a functionality to the visual effect of the book. So I hadn't thought about that at all, Kimberly, but we actually have had Bauhaus with us since the beginning.
That's really, really interesting. And I like that, as you point out on the cover, the X of proximity, and that's actually meaningful as well. Could you talk a little bit about that and why, as part of the introduction here to proximity?
Yeah. So the thing about humans is good and bad. We want what we want, where and when we want it. And over time, those that can give it to us best tend to win. Now, the market economy is great at providing that, but it does so with whatever the existing tool set is. And the industrial age tool set has caused us to have massive manufacturing facilities thousands of miles from demand. It's created things called demand planning, where we're trying to figure out what Rob and Kaihan and Kimberly might want a year from now, and then ordering it and hoping we have it in inventory, blah, blah, blah. But what Kaihan and I realized through this proximity journey is that digital is fundamentally different. There's an internal logic to digital that is non-existent really in the industrial age. And that is that digital technologies of all sorts allow us to compress capabilities in smaller and smaller packages. And so therefore, what they do is push value creation ever closer to the moment of actual demand in time and space. And when we started talking about this originally, people thought we meant a little better supply chain management. Everybody loves supply chain management, but that's not what we're talking about. We're literally talking about business models and technology platforms that encourage us to procrastinate and do as little as possible until there's an actual customer for a specific demand. And that's proximity.
And you know that the COVID-19 pandemic was a pivotal time for digital adoption. How much do you think this expedited the proximity direction that we were already headed?
I think it absolutely did. I think that there are kind of behavioral changes that we can experience in short term, and then there are structural changes that are required to maintain that new behavior. And so what COVID did is forced many of us to change our behaviors. So you do see some retraction back. So, like the average commute time went down a lot during COVID. It has increased close to what its prior levels were. But if you look at the percentage of people who work remotely, it was about 24% before COVID. It goes up to 38%. It's still 34%. So it hasn't pulled back all the way. So I think what COVID did was at least three things. So number one is it suddenly made it created a market for proximate solutions. So if you were offering a proximate solution, if you were Zoom, for example, suddenly you had a much bigger demand. And so you could, or if you were shipping food or sending food to homes rather than asking people to go to stores like, Instacart, suddenly you had this surge in demand, which allowed you to invest in and therefore accelerate those solutions. It also get people to experience like, hey, it's not as bad as we thought getting to know people virtually. I don't necessarily always have to go into the office. So it changed our perceptions, right? And then what that also did was started changing the foundational, like structural infrastructure that allows us to build proximate solutions.
Yeah, I want to build on this concept that Kaihan laid out. The notion that Zoom, for instance, is proximity. And during COVID, I was talking to a colleague about this question, and she said to me, well, that's interesting, but wait a minute, Zoom is less proximate. And what she meant was, well, we're not together in the office anymore. We're, hundreds of miles apart. And I said, well, that's true, but that's through the old lens. The new lens, what we're talking about is value creation. And value creation is happening right here on the screen. And it doesn't matter that I'm in New Jersey and Kimberly, I think you're in Kentucky, Kaihan's in Greenwich or Miami or wherever he is. That doesn't matter anymore. We can be together on the screen anywhere, anytime.
I think that this goes, I teach at I taught at Northern Kentucky University and actually live in Cincinnati. I'd like to make that distinction. Just kidding. And one of the things that they had just recently put together at NKU was a global supply chain business degree. I mean, that was a big focus of the business school. And proximity of production and provision are fairly intuitive business concepts, right? Like you want to have those things you were just discussing. You want to have the product as close to the consumer as possible. But that's not how the world had been set up and how infrastructure had been developed over time. And so what changes have happened that make these more readily available to businesses to tap into? You talk about a lot of technologies and a lot of innovations and even things that you've both personally worked on moving in this direction.
Yeah, well, I'll start and then Kaihan has a lot to say about this. Way to think about this is digital technologies of all sorts. So you can include rooftop solar and 3D printing, and these are all digitally enabled, but obviously mobile apps, AI, et cetera. They enable proximity. They allow us to do things we could never have done before. But then there are also a number of catalysts. And Kaihan and I talked a lot about these various catalysts as we were developing the book, such as geopolitical challenges, problems in the Red Sea, for instance, that have caused enormous problems for companies, consumers, governments, extreme climate events. And of course, your audience is deep in trying to help us navigate the energy transition, thankfully. But climate events, geopolitical issues, pandemics, these are all catalysts to push our economy, our societies, our businesses in this new direction of proximity. But it's the digital technologies that enable us to do so. Kaihan, I know you and I have talked a lot about these things. If you want to add.
Yeah, I think the digital technologies enable us to do things we couldn't do before more economically. But I think also on the, say that's the pull side, let's say the push side is also that the externalities, the costs of making something and shipping it long distances to get to you, those are starting to become internalized, whether that is through the stock market, whether that is through insurance, whether that is through carbon trading. What we are seeing is now a greater amount of the cost of not proximate solutions is now being borne by companies and customers. So it changes the calculus. So whereas a proximate solution would have been growing your food closer to where you are, creating your energy closer to where you are, would have been, it's going to be more expensive, but I feel like I'm doing good for the environment. It is now that, and wait a second, it is actually less costly, right? We've seen a huge drop in the cost to produce energy through wind and through solar. And in many regions, wind and solar are more competitive. than traditional sources, and wind and solar can be done right off the shore or right on your roof. So there's both a push and pull.
And you talk about vertical farming, which I think that's a great idea too. It allows for a lot more urban use of urban vacated spaces and getting food to people in much more efficient sort of way. But vertical farming and protein alternatives and printing food, those are all great. So for so many reasons. But what if I'm a farmer in Iowa or in Provence? How are you going to sell me and my government on these technologies?
That's a great question, but I'll start by referring to the great Austrian American economist Joseph Schumpeter. And of course, Schumpeter was the first person in history to use the word entrepreneur the way we use it today. Now, there was another guy named Jean-Baptiste Say who used it the first time, but he meant something else. Schumpeter referred to the entrepreneur the way we refer to it today. And in his great work, Theory of Economic Development, he pointed out it is not the maker of stagecoaches who builds railways. And that's the notion of disruptive technology. So my mother grew up in a farm in eastern Iowa, and I have great love for farmers and farming community. I spent a lot of time there as a kid. But honestly, the first point of change is not going to be established agricultural producers in the old paradigm. Now, there'll be some that want to push the envelope and I know some who are very progressive producers and farmers who are really taking this to heart and starting to build the frontier. But it's really going to be other entities, other groups with different kinds of interests and objectives that move this along. But your point, Kimberly, about government, that's really where a lot of the, I guess, rubber meets the road or the plow meets the ground to try and help navigate this. But the good news is for a long time, it's going to be small scale stuff on the edges. And it's going to be rising little bits here and there. And most people are not going to pay much attention. But it's when it really starts to become economically viable and take off, that's when it starts to create consternation. So you're seeing in Europe right now, the various countries moving against meat that is produced that is not derived from killing an animal. And they really are talking about, you can only call, some people are saying you can only call it meat if you raised an animal and then somebody killed it and it became meat. I think that's an example of the past. And once people start in not this year, but 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, have actual cultured meat, which is actual meat. It's not a substitute. And they realize how profoundly better, cheaper, zero ethical issues. I think ultimately this will prevail.
Yeah. And we know 38% of the food that is produced is wasted. And a lot of that because it's shipped in long distances. And that cost, as I said before, is being internalized. And so just the economics will be such that that farmer will have to say, I mean, there are at least three options for that farmer, right? One is, hey, this was produced here. This was produced in Provence, and people will pay for that because of its, and you have Wagyu beef, a lot of food, champagne, you have a lot of food products that the value is linked to where it was made from. So there is that. They will need to find ways to ship the food so that less of it is wasted in order to be economically competitive. And so I think that will spur innovation in fighting, food waste. And then there's going to have to be also looking at, is this the right place to produce? Is this where, because I mean, I don't know, 500 years ago, where were we making food? Where were we producing food? We were producing food right outside of the villages that we lived in. And so that is a feasible scenario.
I think that for farmers, though, there's still going to be that resistance, obviously, because it's their livelihoods. And I expect a lot of people reading your book are wondering what they're going to do when their job is replaced by a robot or made redundant by a 3D printer or lost to a creative AI. I mean, we just saw the strikes in Hollywood with writers already concerned about being replaced by AI, right? So how can the future be more sustainable? And how are people going to not be up in arms and protesting and so forth if their livelihoods are threatened?
Well, there will be major dislocations and there will be a lot of conflict. We have to work through that. as best we can. But I'll add a little angle. This past week, we had a book launch event at Northern Trust, a bank in Chicago. And one of our participants is a fellow named Mark Kennedy, a professor at Imperial College in London. And he talked about a notion that he and his colleagues are promulgating called additive AI. So there's generative AI. We can use AI to automate things, replacing humans often. But what about cases where we can do things we could never have done before? Additive AI. And as we find more and more opportunities to use AI to allow us to do things we really couldn't have done before, the humans that figure out how to leverage AI to do those things that could really never have been done before will start to find new roles and new opportunities to find value, create value in the world. So it's not just we're going to replace people and then they'll have nothing to do. At the same time, there is going to be some trauma involved in this as well. I mean, we've been through it. We went through it from the transition from agriculture to industry. It was a multi-decade process. The reality is it's probably going to happen faster than that. So, Kaihan, I don't know if you want to add.
No, I would just.
You've thought a lot about these sociological implications.
Yeah. I mean, I would just maybe add two things. And maybe you want to talk about the Israeli meat company that is helping chefs brand their meat.
Yeah.
So I think that one point is that where value is will change, but new opportunities to create value emerge. So your role may shift, but you may still be, in the same space, but the value provide may shift. Yeah. So, but maybe you want to mention.
Yeah, Aleph. So Kimberly Kaihan's referring to Aleph Farms in Tel Aviv. I visited them the beginning of 2023, and they're making cultured meat. So it's not substitute. It's actual cells, muscle cells grown in a lab. And I tried a little bit of it, and it was pretty good. Now they're making hamburger. Many of your listeners will know this. It's harder to make a steak because steak has texture and it has a feel to the teeth and all this tension. They're working on how to make that work. But really exciting thing for me is, as Kaihan mentioned, they're working with celebrity chefs in Tel Aviv who are saying, hey, we're not ready to do this yet, but we want to develop with you a custom cut of meat that is only for you. That's intellectual property that you as Chef XYZ own the right to grow and sell that at your restaurant or in stores or wherever you like. And we'll only make that for you. And it can have flavor profiles, fat profiles, texture, all these things that you can engineer to very specific specifications. And that was, for the most part, not at all possible before. So that's competing with, as our colleagues in the Blue Ocean Strategy that's competing in a blue ocean because there was nobody there. Now, that's very expensive, incredibly expensive. But you know what? That's where many of these things start. Disruptive technologies either start, and Clayton Christensen would tell you it always started at the bottom, and they were cheaper, but they served a different audience. And over time, they get better and better, and they incur into the core market. I actually propose that it can also happen at the very high end. You get something that's way too expensive, but you have a different customer, like a celebrity chef at a 3-star Michelin restaurant. They do something really cool and exciting, but over time, the technology gets better, the cost comes down, and we're able to do more things that we could never have imagined before. So that dynamic is not directly competing at scale with, say, a traditional farmer. And we're seeing that happening around the world as well.
If I could add two more quick things. I think that two misconceptions sometimes when Rob and I speak about the book are that this is a choice and this is good. We're not saying either of those things. This is not a choice. This is happening. Is it good? It could be good. We hope it's good. And we are going to do what we can to make it good, but it could also be bad for the environment, for society. And it is, the choice really is do we go to the, which proximate future do we create together?
And to add a hopeful note to Kaihan's point is there are more and more opportunities to do it well and do it good at the same time. More and more opportunities to be sustainable, far more than in the past. But that is a choice.
As someone whose field is international relations, and global political economy and development and sustainability, I'm reading your book and I'm thinking, wow, there are an awful lot of people around the world who would benefit and actually really need benefit and access to the consumer goods and services that you're talking about, and formal sector jobs and cities that are better, have better living conditions and so forth. Do you think these proximity benefits are ever going to trickle down to them and be readily available to people in developing countries? Or is it going to still be mostly consumers in those safe markets in the global north, developed countries, and even emerging economies where they have the buying power, they're safer markets for investment? Is this a reality then or no?
Well, Kimberly, Kaihan and I would love any support you can provide to help promulgate this in the global south, in the developing world. We see a huge opportunity to leapfrog. And what do we mean by that? Well, here in the United States, Europe, Japan, we've got infrastructure, we've got established business models, players, et cetera, and innovation happens for sure. But you know what? When you're in a developing economy, you don't have to make the same mistakes we've made for the past 100 years in the United States. You can do the next horizon. So lots of examples. Earlier this year, I was in Rwanda with a group from Twin Global World Innovation Network, and we were visiting business, government, entrepreneurs, nonprofits, et cetera. And we're looking at their health system innovations, using drones to deliver blood and supplies anywhere in the country in a matter of hours, which was totally impossible before that. Using data platform to collect all of the health information from across the country and identify, for instance, the diseases as they're popping up, pathogens as they're popping up, weak signals early, far beyond what, frankly, we do in the United States. And so they're able to try these things because some of them, not all of them, some of these technologies can be scaled incrementally, can be scaled modularly. So if you think about an old power generation plant, those cost $1 billion. They have to be planned decades in advance in some cases. They need huge contracts, huge funding from the World Bank or somebody else who wants to help out. Whereas if you just decide to throw some solar arrays here and there with a battery backup, you can put a couple here, a couple there, demands popping up over here. So you can scale modularly. And so I personally, we think that the opportunity is even greater in the global south.
Yeah, just to add on to that, yeah, my mother's from Bangladesh, and she worked at the UN for her entire career. And we've got a great example in the book about what's about an innovation in Bangladesh. I think that in the West, in the global North, it is sometimes a nice to have. It would be nice to not have my electricity go out when there's a storm, so I'll put solar panels on my roof. In Bangladesh, it's not a nice to have. It is the difference between having energy or having not, having medicine or having not, having food or having not. So I think that the opportunity is even greater there. And I think it will create greater independence and more value creation and therefore more value capture locally.
And more resilience as well.
More resilience. Yep.
I think it always comes down, though, to sort of the economics of it, right? Is it going to be affordable enough? And then also the corruption in these countries and having to work through the corrupt systems to be able to implement some of these technologies and so forth that may be readily available. I hope you're both right on this, and I hope that the projects that you're working on can help move the world in this direction, and having these longer term investment projects that are necessary for developing sustainable projects that won't just be for enhancing life in global North countries, but also global South. And I think that you mentioned, Rob, your situation, your experience in Rwanda, and I've seen this in examples in places before. And in your book, you talk about 3D printing of pharmaceuticals. And it's still, I mean, that still seems so futuristic to me. Drones flying, it's weird to me that drones flying around seem less weird to me at this point, right? But the 3D printing, we've got printers we've grown up with, and yet still that seems so much more futuristic. Why is that a lot closer than what we think?
Right. Well, I that's one of our favorite stories in the book, and I have a lot of heroes that I love, and Kaihan and I wove them into the stories of the book. But one of the top, I mean, he's just nuts. Dr. Jeffrey Ling, medical doctor with the Army. He had 6 tours of duty in the Middle East. He's now retired from that, practicing at Johns Hopkins. And in the war zone, they kept running out of generic drugs. Now, that's not a shocker, but what was a shocker to me, I don't know about you, is he shared with me that we have generic drug shortages in hospitals and clinics all over the United States every day. He practices at Johns Hopkins, one of the top institutions in the world, and they run out of generic drugs. They're all produced overseas. It's a big supply chain challenge, et cetera. So he came home and said, this is crazy. Most generic drugs are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And if I had the right chemistry set, I could make it right here myself. So he came back to the United States. He got a big grant from DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, worked with a team from MIT, and they did it. And you can look it up online. It's now a company called On Demand Pharmaceuticals. So the military is already using it at small scale, and now they have approval to use it in commercial settings. So what's quite exciting about this is in January, they turned on a new system at their first pilot location commercially, in their first pilot location. It's in North Mississippi, in Tupelo, Mississippi. This is a chronically underserved hospital system in a low-income community in many cases. And they chose 6 injectables to start. So it's healthcare after all. You have to start slowly. You've got to be careful. People's lives are at risk. And so they chose 6 injectables. And since they've turned on that system in January, they've had 0 stockouts of those 6 injectables. And this is the first time in the history of that health system. Now, if you think about the difference between that model of having the system sitting there waiting for a doctor to say, I need a dose of lidocaine, for instance, as opposed to the demand planning team in administration trying to figure out how much lidocaine to have 3 months from now and ordering it from China or India way in advance and hoping they got it right. It's a completely, utterly different model. But I'd like to quickly bring Rwanda and Africa, in fact, back to the picture. Dr. Mengus Bairu, who's not in the book because he's been a friend of mine for a long time, but he's not in the book because I didn't know about Bayo Usawa when Kaihan and I were writing the book. But Bayo Usawa, he just founded it in Rwanda. He's originally from Eritrea. And they have 2 container truck size systems that they drop the containers in, and within a matter of months, they're producing monoclonal antibodies. So they're rolling that out in Rwanda right now. Their vision is then to have one in Ghana soon, and then others distributed around Africa. And their objective is by 2030, they not only want to be serving all of the monoclonal antibody needs of Africa, they also want to be exporting monoclonal antibodies to other parts of the world. And here's the exciting part for those not in the healthcare space. Africa today produces almost none. There's a little bit in a lab in Kenya, for instance, but they produce almost none. And yet with these small scale proximate systems, they can drop them in and quickly start to produce monoclonal antibodies where people need them efficiently at low cost.
That's really exciting technology that we're moving toward here for Africa in an entire continent where it doesn't even have one Fortune 500 company, right? So this is something that if they can become producers of something that aren't just natural resources that they can exploit, that's gives them a little bit more business prospects to work with to improve their economies. Kaihan, did you want to add?
No. I would just say, I think you pointed to it. They produce the raw inputs, they ship them to the Western world. The Western world adds value to them and then sells it back to them. That's the current system. It shouldn't be that way. They can add the value right there, close to where demand is, and they get to capture that value.
And in ways we couldn't have done a decade ago.
And shifting from very important healthcare stuff to, you give the example of Nutella, totally different thing, right? Nutella, having an AI create 7 million unique collectible jars is fascinating from an AI creation perspective, right? When you think about this. But when it comes to sustainability and really meeting necessary needs like healthcare and injectables and so forth, we're talking about something entirely different. Won't businesses be tempted to sort of move more in that direction where they know that they can have a ready market of people who want to be collectors and collect like, I don't know, a million jars or something, which just requires more resources and is just tapping into those same markets?
Well, the reality is both of those are going to happen. And there's nothing that we can do or any of your listeners can do to cause that to definitely not happen. What we have to do is take the world as it is and then try and add as much value in the direction we aspire to go as possible. But actually, Kimberly, something that was really hopeful about that example to me is that happened. I don't remember the date. Kaihan was at like 5 years, 7 years. I mean, that was a while ago when Nutella did this, and it was cutting edge at the time. It was super exciting, and it's trivial today. If somebody if you wanted to sit there in Cincinnati and say to ChatGPT, design a bunch of cans for me, bang, you've got it, all done. And that's in a matter of years. So what might be possible in the not distant future? The other thing that was fun about that to me was the value they were creating was the collectability. And that's entirely a human thing. I don't know of a robot that would care about having 1,000 different Nutella bottles, but I'm sure there are some humans who care about having 1,000 different Nutella bottles that no one else has. So this is where we actually find ourselves becoming, for good and bad, more and more human.
Right. Yeah. And I think it points, there is this ability. And I think this is kind of the main story of the book, is that there is this new capability that can be used for good or bad. One aspect of it is customization at scale. So you can customize a bottle that you collect and never eat, put on a shelf. Yes. You can customize medicine to be just right for you. You can customize food that has just the right nutrition for you. You can customize a learning experience that allows you to advance to that next career in the most efficient path, right? So the capability is there. And the question is, what do we use it for?
One of the interesting things I thought that you mentioned in your book is that when it comes to like these sort of futuristic apocalyptic potential scenarios with AI and robots and drones and all of those things that you mentioned, that you make a point of really saying it's not going to be us versus them, the robots. It's going to be us versus us, which I thought that was really interesting. Various things in your book sound like something out of a sci-fi movie that we should, and then also there's the whole campaign to stop killer robots, right? So, I mean, it's a serious thing. And yet that's not really what the scenario that you're laying out.
No, I'm glad you brought it up. It's especially as you get to the last chapter about virtual reality and where that's going to go. Not like maybe it will, but actually going to go. But in terms of AI, I actually ask this question on panels around when I'm moderating around the world. I'll say, okay, when should we expect the robot apocalypse? And I just to catalyze people a little bit. And at least our thought is it's not going to be a robot apocalypse. These technologies are going to become increasingly integrated with us, and I mean physically integrated in the longer future. And so just like it's always been and throughout history and even prehistory, it's been us against us. And that's really the way to think about it. The movies like to do the whole, the robots rise up and somebody codes them wrong. I don't know what they're thinking. Then they're going to take over. And then the wonderful part about those is there's a love interest between the protagonist and some other person. And that it's because of love that love overcomes the robots. By the way, if it really is a bunch of killer robots against people in love, the killer robots are going to win. Let's just be clear about that.
Sure.
And maybe I'm being a little maybe dark here, but I don't think humans are necessarily very good decision makers. I don't think that we are good to ourselves or to our environment. And maybe it's not going to be a bad thing if we give up some decision making to others. AI can help us avoid many of the decision biases that we have. We've got like 200 different decision biases that lead us to make bad choices. Right. So
yes.
I wouldn't default to, hey, humans are the right decision makers.
Yes, we'll see how things turn out later this year, for example.
Yes, it does.
And another point you make is, and as you just reiterated, is that it's a much more sort of direction we're moving is much more like virtual reality, and these technologies are going to be much more gradual immersion into us and society. And it's not a conscious choice. Like, I mean, my husband and I joke about when it comes to who's going to have a brain implant chip first, it is not going to be me, right? It's going to be him. He lined up first. Like, if somebody can go and live in outer space, it's going to be him, not me. I'm going to be the one here, like when it comes to venturing into outer space, I feel like there are two camps of people. Those who are lined up to buy tickets. And then there's me, right? And the few people along with me who are going to be waving goodbye, here on Earth. And what is this, like our space colonies a reality? Is this the direction that we're moving in as we're talking about this stuff?
Kaihan, go ahead.
I was going to talk more near term, getting
Sure.
towards space colonies. I think that the first step towards that distant future will not be recognizable as a change. Technologies that are adopted, they don't require humans to change initially, right? Like the iPad was introduced. There were tablets long before the iPad. But what Apple said is, we're not asking you to change anything. You already read books digitally. This is just a digital book reader. We step into it, and then we discover all this other stuff that we can do with it. I had my first experience of the metaverse, I would say, and I don't know if I've told you this, Rob, but at one of Rob's conferences, a twin conference that he held in Miami Beach. And I was listening, and I was also on Slack, and I was chatting with my team saying, oh my gosh, this person just said this, and I sent a photo. And at that moment, I was both at the conference and I was with my team. And I didn't have a headset on. I didn't have a virtual avatar. So I think that we are flipping into this virtual experience, but it doesn't look like a translation of physical to. So my point is, the first step will not be recognizable. It is happening and it's not recognizable.
Yeah.
And where that goes to, that would be.
Yeah. And it's good to know, Kaihan, you were paying attention during the event in Miami.
I was. And there was more than me paying attention. My whole team was paying attention.
It's great. Well, Kimberly, you asked about space colonies. One of the things that Kaihan and I intentionally did not do in the book is make date predictions. We weren't saying by 2030, autonomous vehicles, by 2040, we didn't do any. We leave Ray Kurzweil. He's wonderful. He can do that. We avoid date predictions, but there are lots of things in the book, unless we blow ourselves up, that are going to happen. And we don't know if it's in 5 years or 55 years, but it's going to happen. So, for instance, you ask about space colonies. There are lots of people spending lots of money to figure out how to do that. And so sometime this century, I imagine we will have some people living on Mars, but we're not going to predict that exactly. But here's an interesting dynamic. A lot of the money and research that's going in to enable humans to be in space is actually transferable back to here on the planet. And I remember early in the exploration of proximity, we talked to Dorit Denoviel, who's a professor of space health at Baylor. Now, isn't that a cool title? Hi, I'm professor of space health, and it's a real deal. And she runs the grant program for NASA called TRISH, which is research into helping humans be in space. And she said, oh my gosh, Rob, everything we're investing in and doing research on is to drive proximity. I didn't know that until now, but now I have a word for it. Why is that? When you're on a spaceship for 7 months to Mars, you've only got what's on the spaceship. If you forgot something, you can't call Amazon. I mean, someday we'll be able to do that, but not now. So all the effort in the world to help humans be effective in space will drive proximity. And we have an example in the book, Interstellar Lab. So this is Barbara Belbisi. She's a venture capitalist, a plant scientist, and she decided in, I think, 2018, she wanted to figure out how to grow food on Mars. So she got a big grant from NASA. That work continues, and they're actually going to be sending some of this up to the space station. And in a couple of years, she just announced at our event last week in Chicago, they're going to be growing roses on the moon. They're doing this in partnership with the Little Prince, the foundation of Le Petit Prince. And so they're going to grow roses on the moon, which is super cool. But here's the even more exciting thing. As we explain in the book, she has an optimized growing system in a pod that they're doing right here on Earth right now. And their clients are Robotech, the biggest ingredients company in the world, L'Oreal, the French cosmetics fragrance company, they put these in their manufacturing facilities for very high value, very low volume ingredients derived from plants. And so now they produce exactly the plants they need where and when they need them. And they're completely absolved of any supply chain issues, challenges. Rather than worrying about how do they get that supply from Indonesia if there's a big climate event, they grow the plant in their manufacturing facility exactly where they need it. And so it's a real business. They're growing like mad. Interstellar Lab, you can look them up. And this is a blowback from the research going on to allow us to be in space, to make us far more effective and sustainable here on Earth.
And you give the example too about the project in Finland that's quite similar. Like, how do you live in a self-contained pod for X amount of months, right? How possible is that?
Well, I mean, I think that's increasingly becoming more of an emotional, social question than it is a technology question, because we can, I mean, contrast to what, 50 years ago when we had the biopod things in Arizona or whatever, it was kind of cultish. Today, engineers can sit down and say, okay, we need water here. We need this humidity. We need, let's build it. You can do it. And then it's more of a social dynamic and human thriving sort of question, which is really where we want to be spending our attention, Kimberly, is how do we build a world in which humans and our new AI brethren can thrive together?
I think that one thing that we didn't get to in the space chapter is why space, right? We know that us being on Mars will require proximity. And so, but why? And one thing, I don't know if it's a good or bad thing, but one reason to occupy Mars is not to live there, but to just do all the dirty stuff there that we're doing right now on Earth. Earth is a pretty nice place, right? We've got good things going on here. But I think that is one motivation for those pursuing it, is to do the stuff that pollutes Earth, do it there instead.
And I was thinking about, as you were talking about this too, that why else do we end up in space? Well, we've destroyed the planet, right? And that's the whole point of Sustainable Planet podcast is, what are we doing that's not sustainable, that's making us consider alternative futures in Mars? And if maybe, then there's the ethical question of, is it okay just to go destroy another planet because we're not doing a good enough job here taking care of our own planet? But this I also, another important point, I think, with proximity that you raise in your book is that you mentioned that one of the advantages of DERs, and if you maybe want to explain what DERs, the distributed energy resources, are, one of the advantages of them is that they have shorter supply chains. But how is this proximity advantage undermined by a shifting reliance from fossil fuels, which is a good thing, but to what you describe as minerals intensive energy system? Are we just going to end up trading one dependence on something that dirty and nasty and exploitative for something else?
Yeah, this is a critical challenge that has not received enough attention. And thankfully, Kimberly, it's starting to. So one of my co-founder and good friend, Peter Bryant, we co-founded a firm called Clario many years ago. And Clario focuses on natural resources, energy transition. So both hydrocarbons and renewables, but also mining and minerals. There are a lot of people who have a, unfortunately, simplistic view of the world, which is, for years, we've been pulling hydrocarbons out of the ground and burning them. You know what? With our new renewable energy, we don't have to pull out anything out of the ground anymore. That's not true. We're going to pull something else out of the ground, which are minerals and metals. And just to give a specific example that is poignant for all of us and will become more and more present over the next decade, is copper. There are only so many copper mines in the world. One was recently shut down in Panama. One was recently canceled in Alaska. And there are reasons to cheer and say, oh my gosh, it's great. We're not mining as much. But the problem is, we don't see science on the horizon that is going to allow us to substitute some other metal for copper to achieve the energy transition. Now, somebody might come up with something. But even if somebody comes up with, and I think they will eventually, but even if somebody comes up with something, you're still pulling something from somewhere. to build into that environment. And if your listeners might have been paying attention to Jensen Huang at NVIDIA, his most recent announcement, one of the breakthroughs they've made in their next generation beyond the current generation. So now they're talking about, I think it's called Rubin or something like this, is a backbone for these large GPU systems, which has a copper backbone, which radically improves the conductivity, the transfer of energy, and all this. And so copper is only becoming more in demand, and all the estimates say we'll have a massive lack of supply over the next 5 to 10 years, a crushing lack of supply. And these mines take a really long time to develop. So if we want to make the energy transition happen, and we do, we're going to have to face this constraint through new and better technology, through advances in other fields, and also through a clear-headed public dialogue about where these minerals are going to come from, because they have to come from somewhere.
I didn't know. Kaihan, did you want to add?
No, okay. Not much to add. I think, there are also other types of innovations that can help us limit the impact or the demand for minerals. So, instead of batteries, there are interesting incentive structures that allow people to share energy. So, while it's sunny on your house and it's shady in my house, I can get energy from you. And that is also partially enabled by blockchain ability to distribute shared information and payments. So it doesn't have to all be batteries.
Yeah, I mean, some of it will be virtual power plants, some of it will be microgrids, et cetera. But there are going to be there are already significant increases in demand for minerals, and we're going to see some substitutes. Like, everybody's focused on lithium, but the reality is there's a lot of lithium, and companies and researchers are already starting to overcome that. So, for instance, we could have sodium-based energy storage. And these developments and advancements, I'm optimistic long run, will come together. Kimberly, in the turn of the 18th to 19th century, there was this fellow, Thomas Robert Malthus, that you and many of your colleagues would know all about, Malthusian economics. And he said, look, society is going to collapse in the 19th century because agriculture is not going to keep up with population growth. And guess what? He was wrong. It turned out hydrocarbons jumped on the scene and allowed us to have 8 billion people on the planet today, for good and bad. I'm optimistic we're going to find an alternative, and this time, God willing, this time it will be a sustainable alternative to allow us to grow and thrive in the future.
It's linking this to the prior question. Have you guys seen the series For All Mankind?
I was thinking about that when we were talking about, you mentioned using Mars. Yes.
Oh my gosh. So the two big questions towards the end of it is, will we give up on Mars or not? And there are people who want to live on Mars and stay on Mars. Why stay on Mars? Well, the reason is that they capture a asteroid that has minerals, and there's a battle of whether we're going to make that asteroid circle Earth or circle Mars. And if it can circle Mars, now Mars becomes a mineral mining.
By the way, I haven't seen this. What platform is this series on?
I want to say it's Apple.
Okay.
I want to say it's Apple. For All Mankind. It's excellent. There are three series.
3 seasons.
Okay, I'm going to look for it.
Yeah. I have enjoyed talking to you so much, and I have so many more questions I'd like to ask, but because of the unfortunately running out of time, right? I do have one more question I want to ask you about. Your book is aimed at a variety of audiences, including anyone who wants to get closer to P=0. Basically, anybody who wants to try to become more proximate to whatever. Like, you have advice for them. And on one hand, Rob, you tell your students when you teach, like, there are some things, like 3 courses, areas of courses that you absolutely should take. And in your book, overall, you're talking about this achieving P=0. Can you talk a little bit more about what this is, your advice is, and you offer a whole proximity strategy workbook for anybody who wants to pick up your book and take a look at this. So how can you help people? How can we help each other to achieve a sustainable end for proximity?
Well, I'll let Kaihan field that. he and I are doing workshops, and Kaihan actually has taken the lead at saying, well, how can we turn this proximity thing into a series of workshops to help people see what does this mean for my industry or my company? Kaihan, do you want to cover that?
Yeah, this is more for your company than for you as an individual. And so just focusing on that. There's really 4 steps that we think are useful to take. Number 1 is envision P equals 0. The moment in your industry in which when demand arises, the value that meets that demand is both created and delivered, not just there at that moment, but also in that space. Everything that's a gap from here to there is an opportunity to innovate. So that's step 1. Step 2 is look at what are the barriers that are preventing us from getting there. It takes 8 months to grow a banana. It takes 3 days to process the banana. It takes a week to ship the banana, right? Each of those are barriers. And then look at what are the trends, these proximity technologies and proximity trends that could help us remove those barriers. And then you just map those two together, the barriers and the trends, and that reveals a set of opportunities. You prioritize those. And the good news is it doesn't take a lot. Even a small step in proximity can make a huge difference.
I liked that in your book, in your workbook that you give, you use a very basic example of plantains or like bananas. You just we're not talking about something like some super sophisticated thing that somebody has to have all this money and knowledge about and patents and whatever that you need to do. You're talking about very basic things. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And history shows companies have been competing on proximity for decades. Amazon, you could say, has just been a proximity play. And I think a lot of Elon Musk's innovations, you could say, are just proximity play. And just getting it there a little bit closer can create a huge competitive advantage. So you don't need to leap towards P equals 0. We don't need to be we don't need to be virtually growing bananas on Mars, right? You can just 3D print from some paste closer to the school or the restaurant where you are.
But also to build on Kaihan's point, there are some cases where getting a little bit closer every year, which is what we've been doing for a long time, will get us a long way. But there'll be other cases where we actually say, you know what, we need to create an entirely different model. Like Dr. Ling's Pharmaceuticals on Demand or Dr. Bairu's Biosawa, which is taking the old and converting it into a truly new model that scales differently, that is small scale, but responsive to near term and a close in demand. Then we create a different technology platform, a different model, and we can do things that we could never have done by just making constant incremental improvements.
And you had mentioned leapfrogging in the context of Africa and developing countries before, but we could really benefit from some leapfrogging in the global north developed countries as well. We've got ancient infrastructure that really needs to be updated. So Absolutely. With that, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you. I very, very much enjoyed reading your book and getting the opportunity to talk about all these advancements and all of the things, projects and so forth that you're both involved in and what you're backing. And I hope everyone will check out your new book, Proximity, to see what other fascinating developments that Rob and Kaihan consider that we didn't have time to talk about today.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Thanks, Kimberly. This is great.
If you enjoyed this episode of Sustainable Planet, or even if you didn't, let us know. You can reach us at mail@splanetpod.com. We're on Facebook, Instagram, X, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You'll also find these links in our show notes on our website, splanetpod.com, along with additional resources from today's episode. Also, you can check out my Substack page at splanetpodsubstack.com. We'd really appreciate it if you'd rate and review Sustainable Planet on your podcast app. Thanks for listening and have a sustainable day.